All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Planning an Authentic LA, SoFi Stadium. My name is Andrea Maciel. I am a second-year full-time MBA here at Anderson, and I also have the pleasure of serving as a VP of EDI for the Association for Real Estate at Anderson, or AREA for short. And I also here have Jordan Ferguson, my colleague, who will also be leading this programming with me. Before I move on to the agenda, I would like to thank everyone at AREA, the Embracing Diversity Week Committee, the volunteers, and everyone at the Ziman Center who was involved in making today's event a possibility. Thank you all. You guys know who you are. So for today's programming, here we have the agenda, but there's two portions to today. During the first portion, I will be sharing a little bit about our speakers, and then they will give us a background on the SoFi Stadium. Then we will move on to our activity, and we will explain this further as we get to the activity. But today, we want you guys to think of the SoFi Stadium not just as an entertainment venue, but as a development that is authentic, accessible, and economically beneficial to the community. And we want you to think about, how is this authentic? Is this a true community asset? What are some things that we are doing right and where we can improve on? But we will, again, explain this further as we get to this activity. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Tim Kawahara. Tim is the founding executive director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate, a joint research center of the UCLA Anderson School of Management and the UCLA School of Law. In this role, Tim is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the center, including the development, implementation, and oversight of the center's numerous programs and activities.
That's good enough.
Yeah, we have a lot more on Tim, so still not done. Tim also serves as an expert resource to the media and frequently speaks to audiences on a wide range of topics related to real estate and the built environment. Lastly, Tim is a graduate of UCLA and the executive program of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Can I get a round of applause for Tim Kawahara? Our second speaker for today is Gerard McCallum. Gerard is a senior project manager at Wilson Meany, a privately owned real estate investment and development firm focused on urban infill locations in the Western U.S. Gerard is responsible for the entitlements and the overall development of the 298-acre Hollywood Park project that also includes the SoFi Stadium. Gerard has also completed the entitlement work for the new Clippers Arena, the Intuit Dome in Inglewood, that will also be located adjacent to the Hollywood Park, SoFi Stadium. Gerard's other responsibilities include government and public affairs, as well as property and project acquisition for other Wilson Meany projects. He's also a graduate of Biola University and Oxford University at England. Can I get a round of applause for Gerard? Now, I'll pass it over to Tim, who will be starting us off with some background on the SoFi.
Thanks, Andrea. So it's good to be here. So how many of you are actually from Los Angeles? How many of you have been to SoFi? So some, but not everybody. Okay, it's a great stadium. So I thought what I would do first is just give you a little bit of background. I always like to include a little bit of history. I can tell you that the city of Inglewood was incorporated in 1908. Things we were just speaking about neighborhoods back then, which were very different. The city was actually named after the city's founder, Daniel Freeman. Some of you guys maybe remember Daniel Freeman Hospital. Although they're so young, they may not remember. But he was a real estate developer and a farmer, and he named the city of Inglewood after his hometown of Inglewood in Canada. Some of its original, so then Hollywood Racetrack was actually opened in 1938. You can correct me if I'm wrong on any of these facts. And some of the original investors were people like Walt Disney, Samuel Goldwyn, Bing Crosby, who they also probably have no idea who some of those people, maybe Walt Disney. But it was very much an entertainment-driven track, and so thus the name Hollywood Park.
And do you know why it was actually built? Because Santa Anita was the big racetrack at the time.
Yes.
But it was a diversity issue because the Jewish folks couldn't go to Santa Anita, so they built their own track. So that was back in 1938.
Yes, I actually grew up in Pasadena, so Santa Anita was our track, and but I had been to a few races when it was Hollywood Park. And incidentally, I'm Japanese American, and we got incarcerated during the war, and both tracks ended up being part transition camps before they went on. Some people would know Inglewood as what's called the City of Champions, and many people will assume it's because the Lakers played there, the Kings played there, the horse tracks, there's a lot of boxing matches, and that's true, and that certainly accelerated the moniker. But actually, it was the marathon race in the 1932 Olympics that went through Inglewood, and three of the winners, the medalists in the Olympics, were from Inglewood High School. And so that was the very beginnings of the City of Champions way back in 1932. Another thing that people don't realize is they think that the stadium is sort of the primary driver, and that's what came along first, and then the rest of the development came along. Actually, the Hollywood Park redevelopment was well in place before SoFi Stadium was even conceptualized. In 2005, a group out of San Francisco called Stockbridge Capital actually purchased the land from Hollywood Park. They purchased it from Churchill Downs and had several other owners that we've discussed before then. And Stockbridge initially continued to operate the park as a racetrack. Part of it was to generate revenue, and I think that was even contractually part of them acquiring the site. They actually did have some experience running racetracks in the past. They owned what was called Bay Meadows in San Mateo up in Northern California area. So Stockbridge proposed development of a master plan mixed-use community. It was 230 acres at the time, which would include office, residential all types. I think it was townhomes, apartments, single-family, condos, the whole thing. Then retail, hotel, casino, and then a public park that was there too. I believe that all in all, it's planned to be like 10 times the size of LA Live downtown. I mean, this is a big, massive project. And then almost a decade into the process where they're doing all their entitlements and financing and everything else, Stan Kroenke, the owner of the Rams, came along and purchased a 60-acre parcel right adjacent to Hollywood Park. And of course, speculation began wild that he was going to build an NFL stadium there, which surely was his intent. But at the time, the NFL hadn't even decided to return a team to LA yet. Both the Raiders and the Rams had left a long time ago. I think it was 20-something years without an NFL, 22 maybe, in one of the largest markets.
Yes.
And so he took a little bit of a risk, but I don't think it was that much of a risk because at the end of the day, that land was going to be pretty valuable anyway. And he probably could have sold it to Stockbridge to add on to their project anyway. So who knows? I heard a rumor, and you can confirm or deny any of this, but that the 60 parcel was actually, there was a Walmart on there. And that maybe because he's married to a Walton, that he had some sort of inside track, and I don't know.
That's exactly it.
That's true? Okay, all right, there you go. But Kroenke's site, the 60 acres wasn't big enough for an NFL stadium and the parking itself, so he soon started a partnership with Stockbridge, and they just folded the stadium into the master plan, the mixed-use project itself. And you can talk about some of the design elements, but it's one of the reasons why I think the stadium is a little bit more lower rise than some of the other. Most stadiums are pretty tall and leave a big footprint in the horizon, and this one's much lower to the ground, and I think will be much better incorporated into the overall project, and that was definitely intentional. So with the combined property, that it became the 298-acre property that we're talking about now. And of course, the stadium became phase one, because the Rams had already relocated to Los Angeles and were playing temporarily at the Coliseum, and so there was a lot of pressure to get the stadium done, and so that became phase one, fast track. And I believe they lost a year in construction over rain or something like that. So, and I believe you can also confirm this too, but I think Kroenke Group has now taken over the whole thing.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
They manage, it's their property. They manage the whole property. We are still the developers of record, so we're still doing the rest of the project going forward.
Yeah, so Wilson Meany, where Gerard was the original developer on the project and has been retained to do not only the rest of the master plan community, but also into it, as you've heard now earlier too, which is another part of the story of developing an area. And as a side note, and I mentioned this to Gerard earlier, but some people don't realize that the first NFL team to be rumored into going to Hollywood Park was not actually the Rams. It was way back in 1985 when the Rams left Los Angeles. Some people, hopefully you remember that the Rams used to be here. We're old, so we remember those days. But the Raiders were here, and so the proposal was to build actually a Raider stadium on Hollywood Park on the site, and that never came to be because they've got some crazy owners that we've all followed over the years. And but that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. In terms of the economic development, I can tell you that sports stadiums, and all researchers and economists have looked at this over the years, they don't historically deliver a lot of economic impact for an area. If you think about it, particularly for an NFL stadium, there's really a limited number of games. There's 8 games in a regular season game. The NFL just expanded to 17 games, so maybe 9 and some playoff games if you're fortunate enough. There's a limited number of special events, so SoFi is going to get Final Four. They got the Super Bowl. FIFA and a number of other different things. But again, those are not every year. Those are occasional projects. So most of the time, when it's not football season, these stadiums lie dormant. Baseball stadiums are a little bit different, and some other professional sports are a little bit different, but there are not a lot of NFL games. I can't even read that, 7 minutes. And then also, of course, the jobs are fairly seasonal. And they're not permanent jobs. They're jobs that are associated with the football stadium itself. So I've long contended that Inglewood was already going to be a target for development, regardless of the stadium, although stadium and the master plan community obviously catalyzed that. But that I would argue that it's because it has great development potential and because of its location. And if you think about it, it's proximate to LAX. It's got 2 major freeways, the 405 and the 105. It now has the Crenshaw Expo Metro line, which will eventually go to the airport, and that was just delivered, like a month ago or something like that. Of course, it has the South Bay amenities that are there. And then maybe more significantly, it was the last sort of quote-unquote affordable communities on the west side. So I think for all of those reasons, regardless of the stadium, you were going to see some development targeted in the Inglewood community. So to me, the larger impact is actually the mixed-use project that's being built as part of the overall project. They have year-round activity. They'll have retail sales. There'll be business travel, tourism, jobs, and a built-in customer base from all the residential that's going to go into the project as well. There may be some spillover effect in the immediate surrounding areas. That's maybe why Intuit decided to develop right there, so they would be able to draw from the amenities that are coming online with the master plan community. So those are some of the private sector economic activity that I think could potentially happen, although it's somewhat limited, although I think the mixed-use project is going to play a much bigger role. In terms of the public finance, though, there was some impact, and I can tell you that the city of Inglewood at the time this was proposed was in pretty dire straits financially. I mean, they were on the brink. I mean, they were months away from bankruptcy. So initially, this project poured in $25 million, a projected $25 million of tax revenue directly into the city's coffers. I think that might be capped for a while because after they're guaranteed to get the 25, and then after that, I think they have to make some reimbursements to the city for infrastructure investments that were made. But that's a game changer for a city like Inglewood. The schools were talked about being taken over by the state. I had several meetings with Mayor Butts, who's currently then and now the mayor of Inglewood. And he said that they were down to 2 street sweepers that worked in the city of 9 square miles. And he said, of course, one of them was broken, and even if it wasn't, the employee was gone too. So it was in pretty bad shape. And of course, the job creation is also helpful, not just for the construction, but also for permanent jobs that will take place there. In terms of authenticity and civic pride, I know that, and Gerard will talk about this, but the stadium reflects the culture, the geography, the climate, and the indoor-outdoor qualities of Los Angeles, and that was intentionally built into the stadium. Of course, it will still be called the City of Champions. Most recently, the Rams delivered another championship. I can tell you that it became traditionally an African-American community. A lot of African-American in-migration during the 60s, particularly after the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. And Inglewood in the beginning was a 100% white community, and now it's about 4%. And then later in the 80s and 90s, Latino community moved in. So part of the authenticity is trying to keep some of those cultural roots there as well. In terms of accessibility, when this project was proposed, there was a lot of concern. Nobody wanted this just to be a mega mixed-use luxury project right in the middle of Inglewood that would not be sort of accessible to anybody else. They wanted to make sure that the park that was going to be built there was accessible to the community. There would be performance venues, school activities, graduations could occur on site and be part of the fabric of the community. And I don't know, you can answer this later, but I don't know if there was a public amenity requirement. A lot of times projects of these size require developers to actually build an amenity. And then finally, I'll just end with some of the community concerns. The Ziman Center did some forums with African-American churches in South LA, and of course, they had a lot of questions about how the stadium was going to change their community. And we said, well, there's going to be some economic activity. If you own a home, and you're going to have scrupulous investors come in and they're going to have a suitcase full of $1 million, and you got to tell them you're not going to take it, even though this is more money than they've ever seen before in their life. But there's going to be an uptick in property values, and that you should keep your homes. And of course, the price appreciation did skyrocket in conjunction with the stadium. Although I would also argue that it's some of these other forces at play. I can tell you that the average home price in 2016, when SoFi was coming online, was $402,000. So how do you find a $402,000 home in LA anywhere? Today it's $739,000, so an 84% increase over that period of time. And then rents have also gone skyrocket as well. So the average one-bedroom apartment in Inglewood rented for $1,100 back then, and now it's up to $1,750. So quite a jump on the rental market. And unfortunately, 64% of the population in Inglewood are renters, so they're not benefiting from the rise in property values. So gentrification and displacement, obviously, it's an issue that's being talked about throughout the city, but a lot of concern within the Black and brown communities that that's going to occur in Inglewood. Then finally, I will just mention that we got to try to figure a way to get the metro line connected to the stadium, and maybe you can address that as well. But that's just some basic background information on the project, and Gerard can give you much more in the weeds and talk about the project itself. So I'll turn it over to Gerard.
Fantastic. That's a great overview. It's a lot of history here. This is basically a city within a city for the most part. That's how we looked at it. And so when you look at the overall design, we've got an illustration up front where we've got residential, commercial, and retail, and there's also a casino on lot, which may make you go, where did that casino and why is that there? There was a casino that was there prior to, and because it was voted by an initiative, we could not take it off site, so we had to figure out what to do with it. And that was actually underperforming asset at a certain point when we actually acquired the property, but we built a brand new casino, relocated it, and that was the first requirement because the NFL couldn't go onto a piece of property that had gambling on it. So that's an actual separate parcel that's not owned by Stan Kroenke to be able to create that sort of demarcation line between the rest of the property. But everything else that you see up there was really geared towards actually getting the entitlements improved. I did 2 separate entitlements on that project. If you know anything about entitlements, they take a long time and they're subject to a lot of lawsuits. This project, I didn't have any lawsuits on both phases of it. And the third portion that was the kicker was the actual initiative that we passed to be able to put the stadium in there. Because if we had gone through a formal entitlement process, that stadium would not be here. Because there would have been so many forces suing and delaying the time. And so there was an opportunity there because we had done 2 entitlements before. We had great community involvement. The selection, the land plan, actually, we did a number of charrettes. I think between myself and Chris Meany, we did over 412 community events. Everything from 3 people in the house to big forums such as this. To be able to gain the support of the community. And out of that came, if any of you had seen the old Hollywood Park before, there's a beautiful racetrack that was just surrounded by acres and acres of asphalt. Between the Forum and Hollywood Park, it was just acres and acres of just asphalt. And so once you got past the edifice of the building itself, the inner field was absolutely fantastic. It was this lake that had flamingos. It was absolutely fantastic. And one of the things that the community wanted was to preserve or some sort of homage to that lake, but they wanted to have access to it. Because this parcel and pretty much most cities in Southern California are park poor communities. I used to serve on the Los Angeles Land Trust, and we were just trying to create pocket parks and farmland and everything else to be able to create some recreation for the community. This, what we did here, because the community wanted that as kind of a prerequisite for any development to happen, we developed a significant park structure here. And so what you see is this basic triangle in the middle of the park that basically creates the spine of what we're calling a village for the most part. And if you take a look at traditional villages, whether it's in Europe or whatever, there's usually the cathedral, and our cathedral is football here. Mm-hmm. And so you see that, you see the retail center, which was designed to actually not be your major retail center. It's been downsized to about 300,000 square feet. And that's because of the changing aspect of retail. We don't want, not that they're available to come, we don't want Macy's or JCPenney's or whatever, or Banana Republic. We really want this to be something more authentic, something that forces you to come to the retail because you're not going to get it online. And so we've got 300,000 square feet of retail right there at the corner of Century and Prairie. And our commercial spine goes all the way up Prairie for the most part. So the first building that went up is, we call it MU11, which is the NFL offices. There's another office building that's about to start construction. And what you're starting to see is now major tenants that are looking for campuses because the property is so large for us to be able to do that. The rest of it, we started our hotel. It's a 5-star hotel that will be looking over the lake. Where you see Public Park, that's actually a lake. That's the lake that we rebuilt as an homage to the former Hollywood Park. And then the rest towards the back end will marry the existing residential areas in the back. So the idea was to create this overall village. The residential blends in with the existing communities towards the eastern end of the property. And that way it looks like it just all is a part of the one continuing community that comes in. Now, Tim had mentioned earlier, the stadium is 100 feet in the ground, and which made this a very expensive stadium. If you've read about it, you're like, whoa, it's $5 million of stadium. It's not quite $5 million, but it's good headlines anyway.
$5 billion.
$5 billion. And the reason is actually 100 feet in the ground is twofold. One, we didn't want this big building overlooking this city, if you will. It would have been out of scale to the overall community. But secondly, from a practical standpoint, we sit between the landing pads of LAX. And so part of it, there's a height limit that also navigated exactly how high we can go. And so that's why you have the stadium down at 100 feet. It also allowed us to create a lot of sustainability towards the venue itself. So it's got this roof over the top because the idea was to avoid just 16 games with the 2 teams coming in. So we did the roof that creates this natural airflow, because one thing about Inglewood, if you study it, it's one of 8 places in the world that has a climate that we call the biome, where you could, where different types of vegetation can sit because it's such a Mediterranean ideal climate here. That's why the horses were racing here. Hollywood Park had 1,700 horses on site, and as well as an equine hospital, and most of the thoroughbreds that ran throughout the world were all housed at Hollywood Park because the climate was so ideal. So we took advantage of that in the landscaping, created the cathedral, and this biome. If you tour Hollywood Park, all the public places showed the 8 different types of landscape environments throughout the world are all housed on Hollywood Park. So I know I'm getting the time set, and so I'll take questions or whatever after that point. So, and
to clarify, I think that it's not a roof. It's actually a canopy that goes over the entire with open air.
Yeah, it's actually a bridge, believe it or not. And it's a canopy, but it's designed basically so we could have more events besides just football. If we ever get rain or whatever, you could constantly film. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of events outside of football happening there, as well as we also built another theater called YouTube Theater as well.
And the project was originally $2 billion or 1.9?
We started off with a $1.8 billion estimate for just the stadium.
Yeah. So, and if you're in development, that's some pretty serious cost overrun.
Yes.
But when you're as rich as Kroenke is, I guess it doesn't matter.
I would say this is the first project, that portion of the project where I'm not operating it to a performa. The rest of it is to a performa. That was the first one, and I was like, okay, it's your money, let's go for it. So.
No, thank you both for that generous background on the stadium, on Inglewood as a whole. I think as we lead into this next part of our event, where we ask for our audience's participation, that information will come in handy. So I'm Jordan Ferguson, like Andrea said, second year MBA. So here we have our 3 topics to consider for today's activity: authenticity, accessibility, economic impact. And so you may be wondering, how do we consider those things? Why are you guys sitting at tables? Why are there pens and paper on the table? So what we're gonna do is, in the next section, I'm gonna pop up on the screen our first topic. Here we have a little blurb and a quote about Inglewood. Inglewood is a historical Black and brown neighborhood within Los Angeles. As of the 2020 census, the city had a population of just over 100,000. It was incorporated in 1908, like Tim said, and the city's in the South Bay region. And so we have some key questions here as it relates to authenticity that we'll leave up for you all. But really what we want you all to do is at your tables, turn inward and start to have a discussion. And the discussion really should be centered around, what does it mean for this Hollywood Park campus to be authentic in the neighborhood of Inglewood? From a developer's perspective, from the community's perspective, from small business perspective, any perspective that you hold, you can define what that authenticity means. And at the end of each section, we're gonna have 1 to 2 groups share out. And then Gerard and Tim will be able to share how those actual considerations were made real time in the field. So we hope that you guys really get engaged with this. We'll be going around answering any questions that you may have. And yeah, so we'll come back on the mic in about 10 minutes. All right. We graciously had 2 tables volunteer to share out. So we'll start with this table here right in front. What was some of your considerations around authenticity? What were you guys thinking about? What was a little bit about your discussion?
Yeah, so we had maybe 2 big themes. Oh, yeah. Mike, thank you. We had maybe 2 big themes we were discussing. One was around when you build a stadium like this and prices are going up, property values are going up, are there ways you can build financial structures to preserve the local economy? I'm imagining as rent goes up, the local restaurant on the block might have a tougher time staying there. So we're just curious about what are the financial ways to do that, because that might relate to this question of authenticity. And then also, we got into like, what is authenticity? Places are constantly transforming as groups come and go. And so what is a sort of benchmark we could establish for saying this lets us retain the local character while also realizing transformation is a part of how places develop?
Well, I think one of the, and you can answer this question, but if there's any requirement to do affordable housing, or at least keep some of the tenants in place, were there any programs like that?
No, there
No,
isn't.
okay.
Oddly enough, Hollywood Park does not have an affordable housing covenant. And the reason for that was back when we started the entitlements back in 2004, the city was in a very different position. And it was considered, as Tim said earlier, 64% of its renters. It had absorbed, and the opinion of the city at that period was that we were the affordable housing outlet for Los Angeles. Los Angeles wasn't doing its fair share of affordable housing. Inglewood had absorbed most of it. And of course, with that, they were not able to actually sustain their tax bases to be able to provide school systems and police systems and so forth and so on. And so that continued to deteriorate the city. So when we started discussions, we were putting up 15% affordable housing as the platform, and the city says we can't support 15% of affordable housing. This is 2004. And so they wanted a structure where they had property taxes to be able to build up. As Tim said earlier, they couldn't sweep streets, they couldn't trim trees, they couldn't do, infrastructure was crumbling, potholes, everything was happening in the city relatively badly. So they wanted a economic driver, and so they did not allow us to entitle actually in affordable housing. The second part of that is that we do have some incentives basically to be able to keep the local economy in place. As you know, most projects of this size have a 30% inclusionary goal. Ours is like 30% mandate, and that's actually by the private developer itself taking on those tasks to be able to, everything from food services to security services, you name it, we've been able to break down those contracts to be able to make sure that the local folks actually get a piece of that. So that's some of the stuff that we're
Yeah,
we're trying to
there
do.
are some other developers that are doing affordable housing in the area. They've seen that there's going to be a need, so they backfilled some of that. So the other thing too that's interesting about Inglewood is that their traditional city center is not necessarily near this project.
Right.
So a lot of the places where a lot of the local art and cultural activities, I mean, I'd like to see some of that incorporated into the stadium site.
Yeah, and I would also say, not only this project, but the project across the street in Intuit Dome, we have a $100 million community benefits fund geared towards affordable housing. There is no other development in the country that has that high level of a community benefits fund.
Awesome. So I think we're at table 1 or something. Anyways, that was a quick 10 minutes. Our table really focused a lot on the first question of, is this the right location for the stadium? And so a few considerations that we tossed around is obviously space. LA is really dense. So where are you going to find a plot of land sort of big enough for this? We did focus a little bit on sort of the pros and cons to the community. Big pro, obviously, is increased foot traffic, which is good for vendors, and increasing sales, which generates tax revenues for the city of Inglewood. We did toss around a potential con of, this may be good for the commercial side, but how does this impact sort of the residents that live around the area that have to deal with the increased traffic considerations? And then I think the last thing we ended on was just a general question of sort of how much has this community programming that may have been talked about in the beginning, such as access to the public and graduations, we're kind of curious to see how much that's actually coming to fruition and what the city of Inglewood sort of plans to take advantage of.
Well, they have to figure out a way to get that metro line connected to the stadium, in my opinion. That'll be and just even for pollution, right? That would mitigate some of the traffic issues. So that for sure.
Yeah, I'm currently working with the city now on its intelligent traffic system that will connect the Crenshaw line to the site itself. We're on the 3rd phase of funding on that. Our final phasing will come in January. If we have that phasing, that construction will start in 2023 as far as bringing that to connect. Metro sort of had looked past that the city of Inglewood would actually become something someday, and that's a bone of contention for a lot of us that live in that community, so we're trying to correct that. As far as, I'm trying to remember some of the other questions, you had quite a few there. Can you give me a couple of others and I can...
Well, the other issue too is that when the tide rises, in theory, all the boats rise too. So the people that live in surrounding communities or they own small businesses that are adjacent to the project, hopefully they'll be uplifted financially as well. Certainly, as I mentioned, the home prices and the amount of money the apartment owners are going to be making now with property valuation increases.
I do remember some of the community benefits so the parks are open. We have one more park to complete, another 11-acre park, which will be in the next phase, kind of going forward. And outside of stadium days, event days, whatever, there is weekend classes, there's farmers markets, there's those things that sort of, Zumba, whatever, in the parks and stuff like that. There's a lot of community-based events in the parks themselves. There's a community day that they do. Next year will be their first community jazz festival that will be open to the community. They have like something called Taste of Inglewood, which is a knockoff of Taste of Crenshaw that's kind of coming into the area there. So they're doing a lot of events like that on site.
And then things like food deserts, and hopefully there'll be more grocery stores and access to fresh produce and farmers markets and those kinds of things that will go in there too.
Yeah.
But by the way, even like WIC and food stamps qualify for farmers markets now, so it's kind of a game changer in that sector.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the two groups that shared. And thank you, Gerard and Tim, for kind of letting us know what's happening there right now. So now we're going to move into our second topic, which is accessibility. Here we have another quote as it relates to the opportunity cost and the things to consider around privatizing such a large swath of space. I know we talked about how dense LA is, but how do you make this development accessible? And so here are some key questions for you all to consider. Again, all perspectives welcome. We'll be in our groups for about 10 minutes, and then we'll share out again, and we'll come out and find a couple more groups to share. So thank you.
And by the way, just one last point on the location. I just remembered the many questions you asked, but is that the right location? It is pretty centralized, and the fact is that the airport goes right over it. And so there's some questions about pollution and things like that too. So I'm not sure that it would have been the choice location to do a project like this had it not been for the available land space. So.
That's exact. NFL only considered 2 locations. Farmers Field was never a consideration. It was Hollywood Park and Dodger Stadium. And if you know the history of Dodger Stadium and the Shepherd's Ravine, I would encourage you to look at that revolt from the community. That was never going to happen. We had started the project, construction had started under Stockbridge when I was working for Stockbridge at that point, and the NFL came at the very last minute to stop construction so that we could actually incorporate the stadium. And so we actually started this project much earlier than most people started. We started the infrastructure build up. We overbuilt the infrastructure. We couldn't tell the contractors why they were overbuilding it in the anticipation of the stadium kind of going forward.
Yeah,
So,
there was also a competing site in Carson, I believe.
Carson was never going to
happen.
It was a methane site.
And the
subsidence of the facility would sink the stadium. It was never going to happen. It was a political play. I led that political play between Dean Spanos and the unions. And that's a whole subject into itself in terms of how you actually have to fight some of these projects.
And the homeland, the competitors were also saying
we got to move, Tim.
It was a homeland security issue.
We got to move to accessibility.
The homeland security issue with the air, because the air flight that goes over the stadium. So they were using that too.
And that was hired by Tim Lywicki at the Staples Center.
Awesome. In your groups, talk about accessibility as relates to the stadium. We'll leave this up here if you need some guiding questions for your discussion. Thank you.
Good.
All right, everyone. Bringing it back to the group, concluding thoughts. Once again, we had 2 tables graciously volunteer to speak up. And so I'm going to toss it over to Hannah from table 3 is what I'm going to call her. And let us know.
Hey, I'm Hannah. I guess I'll stand up. I don't know if other people are standing up. So we talked about a few different things. A bunch of us have either worked in real estate development or are looking to work in real estate development. And one thing we talked about, I'm going to go in a random order, I guess open space, I'll start there. So we talked about how there's kind of a cost benefit analysis of, how much open space do you want to include? Obviously, public wants you to include more, generally speaking, and as from the developer standpoint, you don't necessarily want to include a ton because it sort of, eats into revenue generating space, but also creates other challenges of security and maintenance. So that's one thing we talked about. We also talked about, in terms of shuttle services, the Hollywood Bowl is a good example of, I think, a successful shuttle system.
Is it?
Well, in some ways, it depends on who you ask, but I think that for, the bowl is located in a very different part of LA, and it's also, they've been doing that for a long time. So trying to identify where are the areas you draw from for the shuttles for this location, I think would be a challenge, but if it could be achieved, that would be great. Obviously the metro is sort of the ultimate solution, and that's coming eventually. And then in terms of the kind of events that are available for the community, I think, so I worked in Washington, D.C. with the DC government on the entertainment and sports arena, which is home to the WNBA women's basketball team for the district. And I think they really struggled on how do they program that stadium area when games aren't happening. And I think it's also really tricky because you talked about the farmers market and the Zumba classes. And when you bring those types of things into a community that maybe hasn't had those access to those things in the past, how do you kind of get the community on board to actually attend them and not just have people from the outside coming in to attend them is a really interesting challenge. So maybe partnering with faith leaders or people who are respected in the community to kind of make sure that programming is relevant to the people who live there and accepted by the people who live there. But I think it's interesting because a lot of times as a developer, you're oh, I'm just going to put the events here. But I think you really have to be intentional about how do we program this for the community that's already here and make them feel welcome and kind of give them ownership over these events and this programming. So that's definitely a challenge, I think, in this type of situation.
Yeah, I think part of it is that the market is demanding more open space in buildings now with placemaking. So the market probably drives a lot of this. I mean, even in creative office space now, who knew that developers had to put in common areas with volleyball courts and all that sort of stuff? And now they are. So I think that the market does demand that. And of course, the park was already there, and there was good intentions on the part of the developer to do that. I think on the other issues, like how you're going to get people to adopt new things like hot yoga or whatever, I think there should be an outreach that's kind of this whole new wellness element, that there are other ways that you can participate in some of these physical activities that are good, particularly for elderly folks. Like Tai Chi took off. Whoever thought that would ever happen in a place like Los Angeles, but it did. And so I think part of it is just working maybe with health workers and wellness to incorporate some of these, physical activities and wellness activities. Pickleball is like such a big thing now. Put a couple pickleball courts in, you'll be fine.
I was going to say, great observations. Yeah. Absolutely. One of the considerations, like with public park space, you could pay the in lieu fee, right? The requirements, you could just pay the in lieu fee and move forward, but it's not good for placemaking. No. And so if you're going to try to get a premium for your locations or whatever and create people attracted, you've got to actually provide some open space for the most part. This was really sort of a requirement of the community. That's why we went with what we've got kind of going forward. There are shuttles now at Hollywood Park. Did anybody go to Super Bowl?
Yeah, the parking was like $2,000 a spot.
Well, actually, it wasn't. There was only 600 parking spaces available on site. We utilized this Hollywood Bowl shuttle system, and it worked extremely well. And that was the model kind of going forward. SoFi came on during COVID, so we couldn't hire people, so the traffic officers weren't available, so it was just a mess that first 2 years. We're sort of getting to the point now where we're getting a rhythm down. It is a stadium, there will be traffic, whether you go to Dodger Stadium or Hollywood Bowl. Once you get used to the patterns, you sort of know the shuttle's here, you park on this side of the freeway or whatever. That's exactly the intended goal. And then obviously with the incorporation of ITC, the intelligent traffic system, that's going to actually reduce that burden a bit. The events that we do have on site, if I could be real quickly on that, are operated by the community. So 40 Love Foundation, Social Justice Lending Institute, all of those are local providers that come from the community, so they bring their folks with them. And our intention is for all those type of community events, whether it's we do high school graduations or whatever, is for it to be owned and operated by the local community itself, to get to your point for the most part.
And it's fair to say, I think that entire project is under parked from a development standpoint. Yeah?
Well, it depends on, there's 44,000.
Certainly for football.
There's 44,000 spaces within in the area. It's a matter of how do you manage those parking spaces? And that's what we've been grappling with. But we're by the airport. There's 44,000 parking spaces in the area, 9,768 parking spaces on site, 4,310 spaces across the street, 2,613 parking spaces at the Forum. There's enough parking. The question is, how do we manage the parking? Yes?
Once you start developing kind of the rest of the site, you lose access to some of that service parking, maybe before some of the garages come online. How do you plan that out from a phasing perspective? I imagine managing the parking is kind of key when you start.
That's an excellent question. So the idea for us actually is somewhat similar to what Farmers Field was initially proposing. As we bring on the commercial spaces and the office spaces, is to create a shared parking dynamic, because football is really at night or on the weekends. And so as the offices come up, we're trying to actually swap out the number of surface parking spaces with more garage-based parking. So like the next thing that's going up at Hollywood Park is another parking garage before we actually start the next phase of the retail center and actually the next office building. So that's kind of the way we're sort of going to teeter back and forth, that actually you'll start to get more parking as more of the structured parking comes online. I would say this is a 15 million square feet project. That's larger than Century City. I won't be here by it's that many phases are going to go on to this project.
Awesome. Thank you. We were going to have two groups share, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our last topic, which is...
There's way too much to cover in this.
Too much cover, yes.
Yeah, which is economic impact.
All right, so last topic, it's economic impact. So thinking about what's, if the SoFi Stadium is economically beneficial to that community, where are the dollars going? Are community residents being employed? Before we jump into this discussion, let me read this quote. With mega developments like a stadium comes mega economic opportunities. It's not uncommon for those endless opportunities to be limited to those already positioned for the gain. SoFi Stadium has a unique opportunity to break the standard and bring the city of Inglewood along in this economic growth. Okay, so here are key questions and key topics. You can get started.
This discussion will be about 5 minutes, and no one's going to share out. We're just going to have Tim and Gerard tell us what actually happened, and then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A after if people have time, but we want to respect everyone's time this evening as well. So have at it.
All right, everyone, time's up. To keep the program moving along, we'll pass it over to Tim and Gerard, who will be sharing a bit about the economic impact.
I don't know where to start on this. I think that obviously I went over a bit of the public and private benefits in terms of financing. I would like to see more local ownership of the real estate that's particularly adjacent to the project, because I think that's where you're going to get the biggest uplift. And there's a lot of communities around there, including Ladera Heights and Crenshaw Baldwin now that there's a mall going up there. And how do we get more folks from those communities to actually own their property? Because that's where you get the uplift and the equity, and it's super expensive, and it's only going to get, I think, more so. So how do we get more folks to participate on the ownership side, both residential and in the commercial side as well? So.
Okay, I'll just run down these. Where are the dollars going? Like Tim had mentioned earlier, there's a $25 million sort of threshold for the stadium portion of it, but that's just on ticket tax.
Right.
There's admissions tax, there's property taxes, there's sales tax, and so all those are not only to the city, but divided up to the county and so forth and so on.
Plus the room tax on the hotel, which provides a lot of
tax and so forth. And so the city is actually, when we started, the operating budget for the city, the general fund was about $69 million. Now they're able to hit over $101 million, and we're climbing as everything starts to come on, kind of going forward. The nice thing about the general fund is they get to decide how they're going to spend it. The negative thing is that they get to decide how they're going to spend it.
Exactly.
So it's really important who you elect in those positions, because ultimately they can determine the future destiny of your city at the end of the day. Parks, as we said earlier, there's 25 acres of parks that'll expand when we get the other 60 acres entitled to another 6 or 7 acres on top of that. That is maintained at expense of the actual site itself, so that's not a city expense associated with it. Schools is the biggest problem in that we have no jurisdiction of the schools, and neither does the city government itself in terms of the mayor and what have you. It's a separate entity, and it's not doing well, as most schools are. And that's our biggest challenge, because what's coming in outside of the actual stadium itself is the commercial portions of that. And the commercial portions of it, we're trying to encourage those, whether it's NFL media or some of the other sort of big, I can't announce the names of them, but they're coming in, some big auditing firms are coming in, big hospital firms are coming in, that they actually also hire locally as well. In terms of the hospitality jobs and jobs overall at the stadium, we have a 35% mandate on that portion of it. That's easy to achieve because of the nature of those jobs. But again, we're trying to get jobs above usher, ticket taker, security, and so forth. We're trying to get more people involved in the management side of that. There's actually a provision in the development agreement with the city that says for the retail center, we're going to make our first effort for the hire for the management of that retail center will be out of locals there. So we're trying for that as well. Local businesses are able to participate. We have a portal designed for local businesses to register their businesses and what their expertise are. And our efforts are to be able to break those contracts. Because if I go to you and say, I've got a $20 million contract and I need for you to bond to $20 million, and you can't have the capacity, that overlooks a lot of the locals. So we're creating programs in which we break down those contracts so that more locals could participate. And we have actually a pretty good track record on that at this point. I think that I'm being sensitive of time.
No, that was perfect. No, thank you for running down those questions. And so now the last part of our program will be an open Q&A for you all. We've talked about authenticity, we've talked about accessibility, talked about the economic impact, and not everyone has gotten to share out. So this is a time for the next 10 to 15 minutes for this group to ask any questions that you may have of Gerard or Tim, any specifics, anything more that you would like to know. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Andrea and I will bring a mic.
Hi, I was wondering, how do you drive the foot traffic that comes into the stadium to those local retail businesses or restaurants or whatever other businesses that are around the stadium? Just because our experience with the stadium is you drive in, you go to the event, you get in your car, and you get out as fast as you can to try to beat the traffic. So what are you doing to kind of help move that traffic into the businesses that are near the stadium?
And that's exactly to Tim's point earlier. If you build a stadium, people just go for the stadium event. They get in and out, right? They're concerned about getting there, and you provide all the local food and everything there, and then they're interested in getting out of there. That's why there's not this massive parking lot, and there's a lot of development around it. So as the offices come on board, the housing comes on board, they're actually living and working on site, then your restaurants, your retail center becomes more of a local community amenity than just strictly event driven. So the idea really is the stadium is the event driven, the rest of the community kind of really supports everything else that's associated with it.
And the retail piece is still coming online, right? So once that's in place, you would think that people, rather than tailgate, they would maybe frequent one of these restaurants and then just walk across the path to the stadium.
There'll be a restaurant kind of row there. There's a beer garden going in. That'll go in at the latter part of next year. There's a movie theater going in. There's a 3D concept called Cosm going in. So those are all drive that a little bit differently. And then you have YouTube Theater that's also like 6,000 seats around the lake. So it gives it a little bit more than like the big event. That'll kind of support more of the local portions of it. Thank you for the question.
And I think people will not necessarily just go to the restaurants at the development itself. They'll probably go to some of the great restaurants that are around there too.
Yeah.
I know several that I might visit before a game.
But there's some really unique concepts coming in and by some really interesting people that'll bring people to the site.
Thank you. Jordan, would you mind going back to the site plan slide? My question is about the intersection of institutional, hotel, and residential from a site planning perspective. A lot of times those three don't necessarily mesh, and they can create kind of disjointed spaces. I'm wondering what kind of thought you put into the layout and how those all interact with one another.
Yeah, so the hotel over the public park space is kind of geared to be sort of like convention space and also support, because what happens currently right now at the Forum, the entertainers come in, they have no place to really stay. They don't want to stay at the airport. They usually come downtown or they get on the buses and go to the next tour stop. The idea is to create this high amenity sort of places for that type of activity that's coming in and out, but also to be a bit of a convention space for all the traffic that's coming into LAX. The industrial space, for the most part, is going to be studios. So that's a kind of different type of use as opposed to like the traditional, what you're thinking about in terms of industrial space.
Yeah, thank you guys for your time. I think the discussion that we've had has been great for getting questions out there that most commonly don't get out there. My question is, have you guys thought of anything innovative within the stadium for uses outside of home games? I can't even think of anything, but how to better utilize the assets and things within the stadium when there isn't some sort of game going on?
It's very interesting. So it's actually being used for a lot of events are going there. A lot of corporate events kind of go in there now. There's tours that are going in the stadium now. In fact, the tour concept originated in Dallas. And they generate over $20 million of people just wanting to tour.
With AT&T?
With AT&T, Jerry Stadium. This is already at that levels now. So they've got tours kind of going on. They've got exhibits kind of going on also in some of the spaces. The Kinsey Collection is currently right now on tour there. So they're trying to use the event more than just big-based events for the most part, but kind of try to break it up. And so if you go there, there's always activity going on in terms of utilizing the existing space now. The original idea was actually that, and they've tried this with one or two concerts, is to cut that space down for smaller concerts. It really doesn't work. You have to have a mega, like Taylor Swift and everybody else just did, Beyonce, they sell out to really fill the space and make it work. Otherwise, the sound attenuation is too large for that smaller venue. So that's why YouTube and the Forum, I don't know, most people know that Forum is outpacing Madison Square Garden in New York. It's the #1 entertainment venue in America now because it's so compact and And believe it or not, it used to be the big place. It's now the small place that's ideal for music concerts.
Hi. I think earlier you mentioned a community benefit fund that was being used to support the community. I was wondering if you could speak more about that, like where the money's coming from, how it's being allocated out, and what it's being used to finance.
Yeah, so it all comes from the ownership or the developer for the most part, but the ownership for the most part. And there are different categories. There's some benefits that are going directly to the city's nonprofit for senior activities. There's the housing fund, and these are all the projects combined. I'm just putting them all together. $80 million is going to fund affordable, high-risk loans for affordable housing. And so to sort of subsidize and make that sort of increase the pipeline into the community. There's a first-time home buyers program. There's a significant program for incentivizing Inglewood High School students to go to college or to trade school. And like on the Balmer side, they're increasing actually that fund to actually provide significant scholarships kind of going forward on that. And then the rest is just like there's we call it the ACE program in the high schools now, architects, engineers, and they have Saturday programs where the students can come participate with one of the teachers, and all of our engineers and architects do mock projects over a period of time. They use computer modeling, some small stuff with financials, and at the end of the day, they get a scholarship kind of going forward on that. So it's kind of a lot of programs like that. Other things outside, Intuit Dome's doing 700 community trees, 314 EV charging stations, a TNC center for Uber and Lyft, 20 electric buses for the city to use for shuttling its seniors around. There's a litany of community benefits like that. $30 million is going to retrofit the boats in the harbor to reduce the PM 2.5 in particular impacts on the community. The stadium retrofit and upgraded the software system for the landing system at the LAX to the tune of $40 million. There's a lot of things that are inside of that community benefit structure that goes unknown. There's a nice cultural art program that's going on. The stadium, these two sites will probably have some of the most significant outdoor public art in the next 5 to 10 years, just because it's a 1% requirement of the overall development. So that's a lot of money going into public art. So there's some significant internationally known artists that are going to be doing installation there as well.
And back to your point earlier, I've been to SoFi 3 times in the last 6 months or so, and every single time there was a youth camp that was happening on the field. So it seems like it's kind of open 24/7 to the community, and some of it might be LA 84, which some of you guys may not know, but in the Olympics in 1984, we were one of the first cities that actually had a huge surplus. Most cities spend a lot of money and don't recover it, but we actually made because of existing infrastructure. So all that money went into a fund to create an endowment to support youth sports on an ongoing basis. I believe the both opening and closing ceremonies for 2028 will be held at SoFi as well.
Yeah, basketball a bit into it. There'll be a lot.
Final Four.
Using
there's a lot of youth camps that are there, seems like every single day using the facilities.
The county has its youth camp there, and there's a lot of those type of things. And some of the local churches have, their rites of passage type programs there actually are going on at the facility as well.
Yeah. And just to your point, maybe about like marketing these different things, like I live still in Inglewood, commute up to UCLA. They market all those things in the community. So it's not just like kind of lip service. There's real people on the ground kind of like actively trying to get people involved time after time.
Yeah, if you're, I'm not promoting Rams, but if you're a Rams fan, follow their Instagram page or whatever, you'll see all the community stuff that they're constantly doing in the community.
And so we got time for one more question, and we'll give it to Gio, and then we'll conclude.
What are some of the lessons learned? So what are some of the lessons learned during the SoFi development, either on the private side or on the public side, that you think are now being applied to the Intuit development in the planning phase?
It's probably more on the Intuit side of it, because they're just two different types of owners. For the most part, and their desires are just so different. Steve Ballmer, this is going to be the techiest, most friendliest, face recognition, Microsoft to the Hilt arena, which is completely different than the Kroenke organization that's more sports driven and sort of more, development driven or whatever. Just very two different types. But both gentlemen wanted to create, these iconic buildings that for the next 25 years in Los Angeles, like the Getty or Disney Hall or whatever, you have to come to one of these because they're just so outstanding coming into that. So they both had that same drive, and so that drove the city, the stadium, the facilities design to really be over the top for the most part. And it's just interesting because usually I'm working in an environment where you have to have a 20% IRR.
No.
So you're like under pressure, so you're cutting here, you're trying to, how much it just gets kind of crazy. When you get somebody like this, and that's why these are big pants projects. These are not for the faint of hearted at all. And they want to create that legacy kind of going forward. And you realize at that point, boy, this becomes kind of fun because you could just see what you can do when you have these type of resources and create these really amazing, iconic buildings.
That's where value engineering comes in.
Yeah, that's where, yes.
It also helps when you spend $5 billion on a stadium that was supposed to be $2 billion. So.
Yeah, exactly. This is the flagship for the NFL. The NFL has plans for this this is their international cathedral to the world. And so that's FIFA, soccer, everything is going to go into that. And the NFL is fully on board with that stadium, and that's
one of the reasons why they located their West Coast offices. The NFL are all in the same location.
Yeah.
Okay. The main tenant, I believe, in the office. Yeah.
All right, everyone, we have concluded our program, but before we part, I want us to give a round of applause to Tim and Gerard.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. We hope that you enjoyed this programming as much as we did. And I think we're done with the room, right? Okay, so we're done with the room. Just one quick reminder: if you're taking food out of this room, make sure you eat it outside because we'll get in trouble if we eat it at the building.
Let me know.
Thank you all.